here to talk a little bit about getting outdoors and getting connected to nature. And it was great hearing Barb talk about anxiety, because anxiety is one of those things that after I finish presenting, you may realize that getting outside can provide a little help to that as well. For most people, when you go outdoors, unless you have fears of things that might get you outdoors. And I do. I don't like mosquitoes. They kind of make me anxious, actually. And we're hearing a bit more about ticks and stuff like that. But generally, when people go outdoors, this is the feeling they may get when they're outdoors. This was written by John Muir. I don't know if anybody knows of John Muir. He's a fellow that was born in Scotland, moved to the United States back in the 1800s. And he was really concerned, at the time he wrote this, it was about 1885, he was really concerned about urbanization and the fact that with the industrial age, people were leaving their rural environments, moving into urban environments to get work in factories. And he was really worried that that was going to devastate their health because they needed to be connected to the mountains, to nature, to the wilderness to be healthy. And again, that was 1885. John Muir was considered the father of the national park movement in the United States. He also was the founder of the Sierra Club, which is still in effect today. And their advocacy is to maintain natural places for humans to experience. But the world's changed a bit since 1885, and John Muir's concerns back in the day, about urbanization and people becoming disconnected to nature are probably coming true. If he was alive today, he'd be kind of concerned about this. They did a poll in 1951. They found that about 13% of Canadians lived in urban environments. 1951, not that long ago, longer than my time, but not that long ago. They did another poll in 2011. They found that 85% of Canadians live in urban environments. There's nothing wrong with urban environments, but when we're in urban environments, the chances of us going out into nature are different. I grew up in a city. I was out in nature all the time. You can still do that. But then things changed a little bit as technology evolved. I started my teaching career before the internet came into being. I worked with kids that had challenges back in the late 1980s, 1990s, and they still went outside. They still played road hockey. They still built forts. I worked with kids as late as a couple years ago before I retired. They didn't do that as much. And there's some interesting statistics that seem to be coming out now as we start to evaluate what technology in the past 15 or 20 years has done. On average, people in Canada spend 7.5 hours a day in front of a screen. So the picture there of some younger people on their cell phones, we don't have to go far to see that. We can see that anywhere. And if you've got teenagers or older kids at home, they're probably on their phones a lot. I have been known to communicate to my kids by texting them and telling them that supper's ready, as opposed to yelling, guys, come for supper. So technology has a really good place, but 7.5 hours a day, we're on the screens. 93% of our time is spent indoors. 4 to 7 minutes a day, on average, kids spend in unstructured outdoor time. This is a dramatic change from back when John Muir was concerned. It's a dramatic change from how I grew up. It's probably a dramatic change for a lot of people to see that shift. Barb talked about anxiety. Anxiety, the perception is that it's an epidemic. I don't know if it is, truly, but the perception is anxiety is a really big deal, to the point where there's anxiety protocols in place. As educators, we're taught a lot about recognizing anxiety. Youth suicide is an epidemic. They have the stats on that. Things have changed dramatically. It's actually got to the point where the Oxford Dictionary, and this is older because they talk about MP3s, that's like 5 years ago, right? but they've actually got to the point where they've taken out, a lot of nature-based references out of the dictionary to put in, things like, bullet point and MP3 and technological terms, because kids don't relate to those natural terms anymore. They're relating to the technology that they've grown up with, that they're bombarded with, right? So when you really look at why do we need nature and why do we need nature connection, the other thing that they're finding statistically, because we're kind of removing from nature, things like enrollment in the scouting program, which promotes an outdoor lifestyle, people that actually have enough desire to want to protect nature, that's disappearing. I go to some of these activist kind of, protests around trying to save the boreal forest and reduce logging and tomogamy. I'm there with a bunch of hippies who are in their 70s now. The people that would chain themselves to bulldozers back in the 60s, they're there and they're really old. And I'm not seeing a lot of people younger than me. And that's kind of concerning, right? Because we only protect the things that we love. We only love the things that we know. If we're removed from nature to the point where we really don't care about it anymore, it's not going to be a great thing for nature. So when we really look at why do we need to connect with nature, there's the obvious, right? That if you're breathing, thank a tree. It's like, when you ask kids about where does your food come from? Well, McDonald's. If we lose the sense of where we're actually getting the sustenance we need to survive, it becomes kind of concerning. I do a little bit of volunteering work with grade 3s, and I did ask them, I said, where do you think we get oxygen that we breathe? Well, from the air. Well, where do you get that? They weren't really sure yet. It's important that they know that when we cut trees down, that source of oxygen for us is being harmed. But nature does a lot more than that. And in the 80s, in Japan and Korea, they started doing a lot of scientific and medical research around what is it about nature that makes us feel the way that John Muir described it. What is the science behind that? Because we always knew, you always felt better when you went out in the woods for a walk. Somebody said you can never get angry when you're out in the woods. It actually resets our nervous system. Our nervous system drives everything. It's like the electronics in your car, right? If your electronic system went, nothing would work in your car. If your nervous system isn't working optimally, your body doesn't work optimally. And we have two sets of nervous systems. We have the parasympathetic nervous system, and that kind of runs how our organs work, our rest, our digest, our ability to sleep, our to a degree, right? All of the things in our body that need to work optimally for us to feel healthy. And then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which runs our survival mode, that fight-flight thing that Barb talked about. And to survive from those saber-toothed tigers that Barb mentioned, we need a system that's going to kick out those stress hormones, the norepinephrine, the epinephrine, the cortisol, the adrenaline, for us to be able to fight those tigers off or run away from them. But we don't have saber-toothed tigers anymore. There are dangers for sure, crossing the road, that type of thing. But there are also those perceived dangers that those mirror neurons, start to kick us in on. And those are the things that we need our sympathetic nervous system for. But as we're going to find out, the stress hormones do some damage to our body. So being out in nature, if it's affecting the parasympathetic nervous system, we actually get better sleep. And that's a mechanism of more melatonin being produced from that diurnal cycle, daylight, nighttime type of thing. We have a much improved relaxation. So we feel more at calm with our body. And that's because the research that was done in Japan showed that as little as 7 minutes out in a natural environment, and you don't have to be in wilderness, you can find this in your backyard around trees or flower beds, your cortisol level drops by over 15%. Cortisol is an important hormone for fighting off those tigers. But when we're not fighting off those tigers, cortisol is destructive in our body. It does a lot of damage. And cortisol has been tied to anxiety, right? So you need to get outside a little bit just to drop those cortisol levels down to the point where you're not in fight-flight mode anymore. And as an educator that worked in behavioral services, I saw a lot of kids that came to school in fight-fight response at 9 o'clock in the morning. And learning doesn't happen. You know, the frontal lobe shuts down, as Barb talked about, when those hormones are overactive in your system. Getting outside will drop that down. Improved digestion, your systems are working better, lower blood pressure, lower heart rate variability, lowered blood sugar, all these things that are now lifestyle concerns for fairly young people are all things that are addressed when we're out in nature. So they did a really interesting study around immunity, right? Because our immunity is also affected by our nervous system. And they took people on a walk out in the forest for 3 days straight. They measured their blood, they took blood samples, they measured their natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are the things in our body that attack cancerous tumors before they become a problem. It also boosts our immunity. They took their blood before they did the 3-day out in the forest event. Then they took their blood after that 3 days of walking. I think they were up to 6 hours a day. And they found that their natural killer cells increased by 54% above the baseline. And they stayed elevated, not at 54%, they gradually tapered off, but they stayed elevated for a month. So going out in the forest actually improved their immunity and made them a lot healthier. And there was a researcher, Dr. Quinn Lee, that found it was the phytoncides. It was the chemicals that trees give off in the forest to warn other trees that the insects are attacking or to fight off disease that are actually essential that we have to take into our body. And when we do that, it optimizes how our body works. So it actually is the mechanism that reduces the cortisol, but it also builds our immune system. They've done a lot of studies around mood. If we lower our cortisol levels, we start to feel a lot better. So if we're not in fight-flight response, we feel a lot better. With a lower cortisol level and we're not on edge and our pupils aren't dilating, we can actually be a lot more focused and concentrate better. That's really important at work. It's really important for kids in school. Lowering cortisol levels will reduce the symptoms of stress. So we're not feeling on edge all the time. We're feeling a lot more relaxed. And again, as cortisol levels drop, our immune system improves and we're a lot able to be a lot healthier. We don't ruminate as much. So rumination is when you focus on negative things generally. When you're out in the forest, they've done studies where your rumination disappears. You're not focusing on negative things anymore. They've done amazing studies around empathy, where they looked at a housing unit in Chicago that was physically identical, but one of them was built in a natural, with a lot more natural space around it, and another was a very urban environment. The people in the housing unit that had a lot more natural space around it were a lot more cooperative with each other, got along a lot better, resolved conflicts a lot better. When you're out in nature, because it's a sensory thing and you're taking in the smells, the phytoncides, the smells of trees, but you're also negotiating uneven terrain. It's not like walking down a sidewalk. You might be climbing trees. You might be rolling around on the hills. You actually promote sensory integration. Sensory integration is when your whole sensory system is working correctly. And when that happens, you have improved coordination. You have improved self-regulation. I talked to an occupational therapist. They said, you cannot have self-regulation unless you have an intact sensory integration system. And I know from working in the school board, a lot of the kids I worked with were diagnosed with sensory integration disorders, partly because they never went outside, climbed trees, rolled down hills, and negotiated challenging terrain, right? So improved ability to sit still and listen, improved self-confidence, and improved risk-taking because your confidence is higher. Improved concentration. This is really good for students. It's good for anybody that needs to pay attention to things. There's two researchers, Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, that did a lot of research on what they called the attention restoration theory. And they said, you know what, there's a lot of kids being diagnosed with anxiety, ADHD, genetically, evolutionarily, the rates of diagnosis should not be as rapid as they are. We just don't evolve that fast to develop those diagnoses. And they're blaming it on the fact that people are fatigued because they require directed attention in everything they do. You're giving me directed attention right now. When you're at work, you're giving directed attention most of the time. When you're driving, you're giving directed attention. When you're in school, you're giving directed attention. When you're watching TV, requires directed attention. When you're on video games. All that eventually fatigues us, right? If we're like this giant cell phone battery, eventually our battery wears out. We cannot focus in a directed way that much longer. And that leads to something called attention fatigue. And attention fatigue creates all these things which, if you look at the diagnostic and statistical manual that diagnoses anxiety and ADHD, that'll cover a lot of the diagnostic criteria right there. And it's probably more as a result of we're just burnt out. We can't focus anymore. Being out in nature and watching the fractal patterns are not identical patterns, but similar ones. So if you look at grass, that's a fractal pattern. If you look at a pebble beach or a sand beach, that's a fractal pattern. If you look at a shoreline, that's a fractal pattern. If you look into trees, that's a fractal pattern. Looking at fractal patterns allows that battery recharge so that we're able to do the attention, the sustained attention that we require. Other benefits of being out there, out in the sun. Sun allows us to produce vitamin D needed for our body. Some really interesting research around the microbiome in the soil and the bacteria in the soil. It actually has been scientifically proven to improve your mood. So it makes you happier, reduces anxiety. It also is really important for your gut flora, and they're tying it to a whole bunch of medical diagnoses if your gut flora is off. Unstructured play leads to creative problem solving, independence and confidence, as well as improving memory and improving eyesight. And these are all research studies that they've done that nature does that. So when you look at how do you really maximize the benefits, it's just a sensory experience. You just have to get out there and slow down. But you have to really slow down and notice things. I took a group of students for a walk last year out in a forest, and their one teacher that was with us, she goes, I walk through this forest every day. I walk my dog in this forest. I've not noticed the things that I've noticed. And it's partly because we go too fast. So to really connect with nature, to really maximize those health benefits, we have to slow down. We have to recognize that we're part of nature. We're not some superior being that dictates what happens to nature, although we've acted that way. We have to recognize that nature's part of us. If we destroy nature, we're really destroying what we need to survive. And we have to have that emotional connection. Do you remember as kids, you'd go out, you'd be building a fort, or you'd be catching something, you'd be out in the woods, and you'd realize, holy crow, it's been like 2 hours, and it felt like it was 5 minutes. We need to have those timeless experiences out in nature where we can shelve our cell phone, we can shelve our preoccupations, and just immerse ourselves into what's going on out there. You don't have to go far. You can go to your backyard. You can go to a few trees. You can sit under trees. I'm working with a group of students. They only have a few trees in their school. We just sit under the trees and look at them. You know, you don't have to go far for that. Remember, as little as 7 minutes out in nature, you're going to drop your cortisol level down. You're going to feel better as a result of that, and your body's going to have a lot of healthy reactions. 20 minutes, based on the research they've done, will reduce or recharge your battery enough that you're going to be able to concentrate and focus a lot better. And again, breathing in that forest air, you're breathing in those phytoncides that are essential for your immune system and feeling well, and just engaging all those senses to help that sensory integration process. And another quote by John Muir that I'll leave you with. Thank you.